choir's anthem tees up well my sermon this morning. They sing, "Let my people go," and now we are invited to reflect on who exactly are my people when we say, "Let my people go." And I'd like to begin that reflection by sharing a poem by the Palestinian-American poet Naomi Shihab Nye. It's a prose poem, and it's a story, really, more than a poem. Some of you may know it. The poem is called Gate A4. Wandering around the Albuquerque airport after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my gate, so I went there. An older woman in traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight attendant. "Talk to her. What's her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this." I stooped to put an arm around the woman and spoke haltingly in Arabic. The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "We're fine. You'll get there just later." "Who's picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and ride next to her. She talked to him, and then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, that they had 10 shared friends. And then I thought, well, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up 2 hours. She was laughing by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She'd pulled from her bag a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I looked around that gate of late and weary travelers, and I thought, this is the world that I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. "This is the kind of world I want to live in," writes the poet. The shared world. It's the world I want to live in too. Don't you? The shared world, a world where we look out for one another, a world where we break bread together despite the differences that some would use to divide us, despite the fear that keeps us isolated and alone. The shared world where a sense of urgency around our common destiny compels us to work together for the common good. The shared world where the lady from Laredo and the grandmother from Ramallah and the kids passing out drink boxes have all been anointed, sprinkled by powdered sugar from the same batch of cookies. The shared world. It kind of breaks my heart to read this poem because the experience it describes sometimes feels so distant from the world that we live in right now. Far from a shared world, ours too often feels like a polarized world, a privatized world, a militarized world. And for these last few years, it's just been a pent-up and isolated world. But here we are. It's our world. And in the end, the poet writes, not everything is lost. This shared world can still happen anywhere. And she's right. It can happen anywhere. And it does. What would happen if we thought of this little meeting house in Harvard Square as our own gate A4? Our own humble experiment in building a shared world. Week after week, we share with one another our joys and sorrows and fears. We take meals to one another and give each other rides to the doctor. On Tuesday evenings, we serve and share a meal with folks experiencing food insecurity in our neighborhood. Once a month, we go outside on Mass Avenue and ring our bell, sounding the alarm for climate justice. If I come to church early enough, I meet the homeless youth who've spent the night here just as they're leaving. The beds that they sleep on every night are just underneath where we sit right now. If I leave my office late enough, I run into the folks from the Queer Alcoholics Anonymous group that meets in the parlor. It's not like we're saving the world here. But it matters that there are places like the church where our moral imaginations are reoriented toward the shared world. Places where, after 3 years of pandemic isolation, our bodies can feel again what it's like to live in the shared world. Places like the church where we cultivate the habits of heart, mind, and action that build and sustain the shared world. Singing, praying, caring for our children, breaking bread with strangers, working together in common cause. Think on your life. Where are the places, who are the people that turn your moral imagination toward the shared world? Next Tuesday is a good example. That's the day of our big action for housing justice with GBIO, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. We're expecting 1,000 people there. And if you go, I want you to notice who comes. Folks from congregations all over the city. People of many races and faiths and income levels, tenant groups, immigrant groups, labor unions. The stated goal of the gathering is to leave with firm commitments from our elected leaders to fund more affordable housing, and that would be a great victory. But another possible outcome of a gathering like that is that we are all changed. That we look around the room and see folks who might not look like us, or come from the same part of town as us, or believe the same things we do, and that we nonetheless feel with them a sense of connection, kinship, and accountability to one another's best interests. Divided no more, isolated no more, once again citizens of one city, a shared city in a shared world. In times like these, times of isolation, polarization, fear, our work for justice is an opportunity for us to widen the circle of our moral imagination. And to this work, I suggest we bring this important question: who are my people? Who are my kin? Because it's one thing to work for someone else's liberation and kind of keep it at arm's length like you're doing something good for someone else. But it's quite another thing to discover and to know deep down that somehow your liberation is inextricably bound to theirs, right? And it's one thing to think of solidarity as an effective political strategy, but it's an entirely different thing to recognize that solidarity is a spiritual discipline, a practice of identifying with and feeling kinship and accountability with an ever larger slice of the human family. To ask who are my people is to take our intersectional work for liberation to a deeper level. To see it not only as a struggle for justice, but as a path for us to live more fully and generously, more lovingly. It's a beautiful thing when this happens. When our work to build the shared world ends up opening our hearts and helping us be more free and loving. Has this ever happened to you? It's happened to me. I've watched it happen to others. I'll just tell one story. I'll never forget about 15 years ago, I helped lead a campaign to legalize gay marriage in Washington, D.C., right? The district would become just the 7th jurisdiction in the country to legalize same-sex marriage and the first below the Mason-Dixon line. But I'll tell you, opponents of marriage equality believe that they could win by exploiting the divisions that already existed in that diverse and segregated city. They tried to drive a wedge between gay folks and straight folks, between white folks and black folks, rich and poor, secular and people of faith. Divide and conquer. It seems to be the playbook these days. Well, through that campaign, I came to work closely with a man named Dennis Wiley, the Reverend Dennis Wiley. Dennis is a Baptist preacher who, with his wife, the Reverend Christine Wiley, pastored a church in Anacostia, historically an African-American part of D.C. And I got to tell you, no one in D.C. expected to find a black Baptist straight clergy couple working with someone like me to lead a struggle for marriage equality, right? But together, the Wileys and I built this movement of more than 100 D.C. religious communities for many faiths and cultures and races. And as you might imagine, Dennis and Christine were very powerful and convincing spokespeople for marriage equality. And they risked a lot to lead a movement for gay rights. They had longtime members of their church quit the church on them. They had other folks withdraw their pledges and tithes. Yet the Wileys remain utterly committed. And on the last night of the campaign, the night before the vote to legalize marriage, we gathered our supporters for one last big rally. And so imagine hundreds of people packing a gymnasium, people of many races and cultures and gender expressions, but most of us that night, LGBTQ folks. And we asked Dennis, the Baptist preacher, to be our final speaker, to give us a blessing and to close out the night like only a Baptist preacher can. And so at the end of the rally, Dennis stepped up to the lectern like I'm speaking to you today, and the auditorium fell silent, waiting his words. And he later shared with us what happened to him in that moment as he looked out over that crowd. He said, "Rob, when I got up to speak and looked out over that sea of beautiful faces, all of whom were waiting for me to share with them a word of hope, in that moment, I realized that my whole life, I'd been taught that those people were not my people. Those beautiful people were not my people. That as a straight black male Baptist minister, I shouldn't be at that rally. And then I remembered a story from the Bible, he said. He's a Baptist preacher. He's always got to work in a story from the Bible there. He said, I remember the story when Jesus is sitting with his disciples. His disciples, some of them outcasts as well, with whom he'd built and shared a movement. And someone interrupts Jesus in that meeting and says, Jesus, your family's waiting for you outside. And he said, no, this is my family right here. These people I built this movement with. And Dennis said, that night, standing before the crowd, I realized that through this struggle, my understanding of who my family is, who my people are, has grown. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's the greatest gift I've been given through this campaign. Can you remember a time when your understanding of who your people are was enlarged? Who are your people? For whom will you show up in these times of division and fear? Dennis's story reminds me of a line from James Baldwin that I'll close with. Baldwin writes, if the concept of God has any validity or any use to us, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. And if God can't do that, we might as well get rid of him. Amen. Friends, let's get rid of everything that's keeping us divided and alone. And instead embrace a spiritual vision that enlarges us. If every day we ask, who are my people? And if every day we can mean at least one person more, then we'll know we're on the right track. Then we'll build a shared world for all of us. May it be so, and amen.